Welcome to the Reel to Reel podcast, where the stories behind the board go on record. I'm your host, Bruce Hensel, and we're here to give you an insider's look at the audio industry. I'm joined by my co-host from the Melrose audio team, Isra Batista, and this month's guest, John Kurzweg. To quote John's website, John's a multi-platinum record producer and musician, multi-instrumentalist, singer-songwriter, who first became known for his work with the successful post-grunge band Creed in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Please welcome John Kurzweg. Hi, John.
Hey, Bruce. Hi, Isra. Great to be here. How you guys doing today?
Doing well. I guess a good place to start is we have a lot of listeners who do home recording, and you've recorded some platinum albums in houses, haven't you, John?
Yeah, I was lucky enough to be able to do that. I've done, all three Creed records were recorded in houses, mixed elsewhere, but
right. Do you do any kind of audio treatment to the rooms when you find a space and choose it to make the record?
Somewhat, but often little to none. It just depends on what the rooms are like. That's one of the weaknesses in my knowledge, by the way. I wish I'd learned more about audio acoustics. It would have helped sometimes, but I was lucky enough that on the first two Creed records, the first one was done in a house that I had on Cantor Court in Tallahassee, Florida, that had a great living room. It was big, had a high ceiling. If anything, the decay length of the room mics was a little too long for me, which was also true of the second Creed record, which was done in a rented house in Tallahassee that was all a huge living room for the drums, all wood floors, and again, really good setting. Not many reflection problems or anything like that. You know what I mean? Because the walls were far enough away. And if anything, I wish the rooms had been slightly smaller on both those records. If I heard a problem, we dealt with it. But like on those first two records, all the vocals were done in bedrooms and they were curtained and carpeted. And if we heard a problem, maybe we would put up a little more deadening or something, but we didn't really... I didn't hear anything weird while we were tracking. On the third Creed record, which was also done in a house, Weathered was actually mixed in the box and in that same house. On that record, we used an SM7. So it didn't really matter, for vocals. You know what I mean? That's one of the things I love about the SM7 is you just put that on the singer and it kind of doesn't matter where you're at, and everybody sounds... I didn't always use that mic on everybody, but that mic, I've found over the years, I've never found someone that it didn't sound good on, including female vocalists, which surprised me. I didn't expect that the SM7 would sound good on everybody, but it really sort of does. So.
I think the first time I ever saw anybody do a vocal on an SM7 was Stephen Stills at Criteria, and he would sing with a pair of 4311s for headphones. They were on mic stands, one speaker on either side of his head, and the mic was in the middle. And it was a great vocal sound, and because of the positioning, there was total cancellation of the speakers. So there was absolutely no bleed into the vocal microphone.
Right. You do that. I've tried that trick once or twice. And the great thing about an SM7 is if you turn the monitors down enough anyway, you can get away with vocals without headphones. If you're not blasting them too much anyway. But I was gonna ask you, were you involved with the Manassas record that that first Manassas record?
No, I got involved with Manassas as a live sound engineer right after I was working for Bill Graham. At the time, I was working at the Fillmore West, and we went on tour with Stephen Stills and the Memphis Horns. And Stephen asked me if I'd be interested in coming to work for him because he was putting together this band. So they went back to Miami, recorded the record, and I joined them in England for their first tour. So,
Oh, nice.
but I was around for the second record, the Down the Road record at Caribou, because at that time I'd moved from San Francisco to Colorado, and at that time, Stephen Stills of Manassas was there, Dan Fogelberg, Richie Furay, and Joe Walsh had just moved there. And Joe was an old friend of mine from college. So I went to work after I left Manassas, I went to work for him with Barnstorm. So
nice.
Yeah. And
which I'm a crazy Barnstorm fan and Joe fan. So we're just going to hijack the podcast now. We're just going to talk about that now. We're just going to talk about Bruce and Joe Walsh and Stephen Stills, and because that's all I want to know about.
Well, actually, how different was it? Like, at that time we were working with Creed, Puddle, and Mud. When it comes to like the budgets in the house studios, because like nowadays, for example, if somebody goes to a home studio, they're expecting lower budget. They're expecting, obviously they still have high expectations, but how was it like back in the day where a home studio wasn't that like art? A lot of artists maybe wanted to go to like the bigger studios. How, like, would they go with the same budget to the home studio and just use that budget on gear, or was it more of a like, okay, we're just here because we don't have the budget?
Whenever it was an independent artist that had no label, it was always the latter. It was always like, hey, let's save some money. And but everybody would listen to what you were doing. I mean, I got hired because people would listen to how my work sounded. So then they'd make that decision. And sometimes people also hired me to go into studios, which of course I did. Some of the bigger records that I was lucky enough to be involved with were also done in studios too, like Puddle and Mud and stuff. But with Creed, the first record was all about budget because they were paying for that themselves, and I believe the manager, Jeff Hansen, had told them, he said, it was a nice compliment to me, but he said, here's the deal. If you're going to record in Tallahassee, which is where they lived at the time, you're going to do your record with John. Otherwise, we have to go to a real city. We have to go to Atlanta or Orlando or Miami. We have to go to a real studio where we can hire we would know who did what, because at the time, the compliment he gave me was, John's the only guy I trust around here to make something sound like a record. And that was 1996. And, but with Creed, with the second and third records, it was a decision. It was them being frugal. They would we talked about it. And then they came up with the thing, well, we really liked working in a house, but for the second and third record, let's not do it at your house, bothering, my wife and other things that were going on. She had an office there and whatnot at the time. It was a matter of, they had a budget. They made an offer to me that would cover me buying some gear. I already had some good gear. I had some Neves and some APIs and a few good mics. And so I was able to supplement that. And we even rented some for the, maybe for second and third, we rented a few things. Like I think I rented a few more Neve channels, but they were able to save money, by going, let's camp out here for, I think we might have recorded for at least 2 months, maybe 3, maybe 4, and then mixed. The mixing took a little longer than we expected. I think the mixing might have been 6 to 8 weeks or something like that on that record, on the second one. So they, I had done it my whole life. I had worked both. I had worked in houses and in studios. So I was going to be fine either way. So I just said, but I did have to spend a few weeks searching for the house to record the second Creed record, Human Clay, with a realtor. You know what I mean? Like going around, like seeing what houses were. Yeah. And that, that kind of stuff I don't enjoy that much. It wasn't that fun, like
going to
look at
the tours and like clapping and like be like, okay,
totally.
like
As the first thing I do, I'd walk in a house and I'd go like that.
and the realtor like, what's going on?
We found a house that didn't have any super close neighbors, that was out on Baum Road, Baum Road, I think. And hope I'm saying that name right? The
Sounds like it.
And so and it was a big house. It had enough good sized bedrooms. I was like, okay, this will be the guitar room. We'll put the guitar amps in here, the cabinets. And this will be where Scott sings in here, and we'll put the drums out in the living room. And on all three of those records, I believe we just did bass DI through different kind of preamps and different things like that. But yeah, so I had to, you clap your hands, you go, this will work fine. So I probably looked at about 8 houses before I found that one, and again, that's not, that wasn't fun, but it was what it was. So,
well, I think the important thing about recording in a house is there's just less pressure on the artist in terms of paying the hourly rate that studios were getting at that time, and makes it more relaxed. I've always enjoyed those situations.
Absolutely. Now, I don't know that much now because I haven't had to hire a studio lately, like to rent a studio, and I don't really run a commercial studio. So, but I'm imagining that it's probably more competitive now. Like studio cost has probably, I don't know if it's come down, but it probably hasn't gone up. So I would imagine they're all living a little more similar now in a price range. But is that true?
Yes.
For what you guys know? Yeah.
I used to operate a professional studio for 5 years. I actually recently closed it down a couple of months ago, and unfortunately, we literally had to compete with the home studio prices because what's happening now, it's like people are just buying these houses and it's like they're renting every room and they're turning them into these like super like gear, like full of like gear. And basically they would have the same gear, just don't have a live room. So for like when it comes to like recording like vocals and stuff, people will be like, "Oh, I might as well just go to this place. They have this expensive microphone, they have this gear, and I can just." And I'm like, "Wow!" So it kind of, yes, it was very very competitive in that sense. But then at the same time, we had the upper hand of having like 3,000 square foot for like people to use as a live room. So that was like better for them to like. Like that's something you can't find in houses. So we could be more demanding on that area. But yeah, it was tough.
Yeah, I know here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, when I moved here in 2003, there was one good studio here. That when I say good, what I mean that had like real gear, real mics, real mic pre's, a real console. And then there was me. In my studio that I built, and nobody else had real gear. But now everybody has real gear. I mean, like everybody that has a bedroom studio in this town has real stuff now. And a lot of that is it's more affordable now, as if you buy clones and things like that, which are scary good. I own some Neve clones and things like that. It's kind of scary how good all that stuff is.
Also, there's the payments plans now. Like all these, you can buy gear paying $70 a month, and you're gonna be like 32 months paying it, but you're still gonna have that Neve preamp.
Yeah, it's a new version of back in the day. See, some people may not know is that back in the 90s and even in the 2000s for a while, there weren't all these companies making these knockoffs of LA2As and And AMS hadn't even reissued Neves yet, really. And so what you dealt with were these dealers, and they literally were almost like drug dealers. Like the way they'd call you up and go, "Hey, John, I've got some 1073s here." And sometimes too, they'd want something you got. They go, "I know you've got those 2 Trident A ranges. How about I trade you some Neves for your A ranges?" Me not knowing my A ranges had gone from here up to like here. I go, "Oh, that's great. Let's do that." But anyway, the only way to get that stuff was through these guys that also racked the gear themselves and made the power supplies. So there weren't all these companies doing it. And there was the internet existed, but there weren't sites and things like that to go shop. Like, you know what I mean? You did your shopping over the phone usually,
Wow.
and yeah. I mean, or you just, these guys, you would just deal with whatever they had in stock, that they were like, "Well, I've got a U-47 and LA2A here too. You want, and it's a whole different world now. It kind of freaks me out, but yeah.
Yeah, I think Vintech over in Tampa was one of the first
They
to
were,
to issue Neve clones.
and they're good. They're
Yeah,
good. I don't have any of those, but I've used them and I like them a lot. Dallas, is that his name? I think the guy that
I
runs
think
that
so.
company.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, he was one of the first in, and now a lot of people are doing that. Yeah.
Well, great segue to gear here. I'd like to talk about your PSP presets here.
Sure.
Do you want to give us a little background of how that all came about?
Well, I I remember in 2003, it was right after I moved to Santa Fe from Florida. I was online one day and there was a blurb or something about PSP's Vintage Warmer 2. And I'd never heard of PSP at the time. I think they were fairly new. And I downloaded a demo of it. And it was the first plugin that I ever felt got close to hardware sound. It sort of reminded me of my TubeTech CL1Bs, which are, sort of LA2As, but with attack and release and maybe a little less grain and a little smoother. But I was impressed. And so I bought the Vintage Warmer at some point and just used that. And then, gosh, probably around 2010, they started coming out with a lot more stuff. I mean, they had been slowly, but they released like some console EQs and things. And I bought some more of their stuff and I liked it. I mean, everything of theirs had a nice analog feel to it. Like it just, I don't know. I thought they were doing good emulations and they weren't doing on this, right on the money emulations. They weren't trying to do that. They were sort of like trying to just catch the flavor of things. And probably back in 2016, I was at NAMM in Anaheim, and I ran into those guys. And I went up to them and talked to them, and I don't know what it was. We just clicked, like it was, I talked to a lot of plug-in manufacturers at those shows, but we just seemed to click about audio, and they let me ask them a lot of questions. And the 3 main guys at that company, and I just loved them, by the way, too, as people. I really like those guys. And they just they would start keeping me informed about new plugin releases and bring me in to be part of the beta testing. And their channel strip, which changed names a few times before it came out. I'm sure there were other producer engineers that probably had suggested to them, but I made a strong case to them that they should make their own channel strip. that had kind of everything in it. And I helped them, along with a lot of other people, work on that for a while. And, they just send me a version of it, and I'd listen to them and give them my opinions about stuff. I wasn't really technical with them at all, other than that I might make a suggestion about like the dynamic EQ section of it, or different parts of it. But that's how. And so right before they released, they would just say, "Hey, would you make some presets for this stuff?" And my presets, I don't know how other people feel about them, or if they've tried them. I feel like mine are probably a little more boring than some people's presets, because I don't go for cranking. I don't know where somebody's starting from. With what it is they're throwing the thing on. So I just come up with a basic preset of a starting place, like with their saturators. And a lot of my stuff's very subtle. Like I'm looking to make a vocal or an acoustic guitar just sound a little bit better than it already is. And that would be how I'd come up with a preset. Because again, I don't know what mic they've used. I don't know what they're recording. So, their source, the acoustic guitar that they're getting ready to put the plug-in on, may be really bright and thin, or it might be dark and muddy. I just don't know what. So I'm just coming up with sort of a starting place.
And I find that interesting because some of the younger engineers, like they get these like plugins and like saturators and compressors and stuff, and they've never tried the real thing. They've never sat in front of an analog board. And I find it interesting that you touched like my plugin is boring, and I feel like for people that start, like that's a good reference. I feel like that will be a great reference, because that way they don't have to be like, okay, I've never been in front of something that saturates, but this is a starting point, versus like you have more modern engineers that they start like cranking all the things because they want to hear everything, and confuses. Like it happened to me when I was starting. I started in that time where plugins were starting out, and they were still expensive, but I could still touch some of the analog gear, and I would be confused with the plugins because I'd be like, okay, how am I supposed to know what saturate? Like, how much should I saturate? And I feel like having
Right.
these presets, they're like a great starting point for anybody.
Yeah, with anything, we've got to use our ears. But at the same time, I can tell you almost every saturator that's been put out there by any plugin company, at their, say, medium level to even maybe 25%, are way too high to me. Like they're just I'm like, wow. Like, so there's a couple saturators, for instance, that give you a 1 to 100%. I'm often down in the 1% level of it. And I've checked it in Plugin Doctor. I don't know if you guys know about this.
I've heard.
You can go look at it and you go like, oh my God, the harmonics are like at minus 25 dB, whereas I know most analog gear that I like, it's down at 75, maybe 50, at minus 50, so you can even use your eyes with something like that and go check it. I've checked some of one of the great things about that Plugin Doctor plugin is you can look at hardware, and you can even try to match your hardware with plugins and stuff. I've wasted way too much time doing that.
Oh yeah,
Haven't we all?
But it's fun, and I've learned a lot from that. And then of course, at the end of the day, though, you've got to go back and just use your ears. And so, and sometimes saturating the heck out of something is what you want to do. Sometimes that's a great thing, but yeah, I think most saturator plugins are a little heavy-handed. I'm always turning them back, or taking that mix control and turning it way back.
That leads me to the next question, John. I know we've got a lot of young engineers and producers as listeners here, and I wanted to get your opinion on management for engineers and producers and whether you have a manager at this point or not.
I don't right now. I wish I did, because the one that I had a great producer manager for a while named Matthew Freeman, who was, did a great job for me and really spoiled me in a way, because I was so much just business crap that I didn't have to worry about. He just took care of that. He made all the phone calls. He made, and I guess I was with him from 99 till about 2012, something like that. So yeah, about 10 years ago. And I miss it because now I have to do all that stuff myself, and I don't have the greatest business head, and I don't like talking numbers and things like that, or sometimes even just scheduling is like, oh, God, let me get the calendar out and look at that, But I mean, if you can get one, I have to say I didn't have one till after Creed happened, and surprisingly, I couldn't get a manager till right before the second record. Even though I had a record that had sold 6 million copies, I would call all the producer managers and they weren't interested. I'd explain to them who I was, and even that I had a background, that I had been an artist before on Atlantic Records and had worked with the great Ken Scott, and had been around, been around studios and all that. But nobody wanted to kind of take a chance on me till Matthew Freeman called me. He was with the Lippman Agency at the time, so I mean, I think it's a helpful thing if you've got somebody that wants to manage you. Just try it for a while. I'll be honest with you, Matthew. One of the great things about Matthew, and I found this in the industry, as you get higher up in it, it's not always the case, but he was one of those guys that just went, we don't do contracts, we just make an agreement. And, I follow through with it. You follow through with it, and here's how much you pay me. So, it was like, let's do this for a while. And if you don't like it, we'll stop, I won't manage you anymore. And like I said, we lasted about 13 years and stuff. So,
Yeah, I would think that the main advantage is that they're generally at least aware of any new projects coming on, and they're able to find a producer work, and that I think is the biggest advantage of having a manager at that point.
absolutely. And if you're busy in the studio, he's busy, hopefully fielding all those calls and stuff, and looking for work if he needs to, but also fielding the calls. And then, I miss all that. Like I said, he really spoiled me, because I just didn't, he'd literally, we'd start talking about some complicated thing, and he'd just literally say, I'll take care of it. I'll call you back to let you know where to show up, where your flight is, where your this is, what is, and when to be there. And, it's like, okay.
Yeah, having a manager is a good thing.
Yeah.
I do have a question for you, John, which is actually, it's something a lot of us have been, I don't want to say struggling with, but the COVID. Okay, how was that transition for you? Like going from the normal world to COVID, and then from COVID back to it. Like, how did that affect it? Your work or anything you've been doing through COVID.
Well, for me, it wasn't too big of a change. I've only been working remotely long distance since COVID happened. So I haven't been in a studio for 3 years. And that was not a big deal for me, because I was already about 75% of my work was just mixing remotely anyway. and then I had a few clients where I would go in the studio and work. But most of my work was remote already. So the biggest change there for me, other than not playing live music, which I finally just did my first gig. I went back to Florida about a month ago and played a reunion gig with one of my own bands. It was the first time I'd played in 3 years. So I've stopped all gigging too. That and that's been a big change. But the newest thing that started was there's a studio in Tallahassee, Florida that I still work with from time to time called Gasoline Alley. And they have an engineer there, Kyle, who came up with this like, hey, I think we can like, what do you think if you produce some sessions for some artists here remotely using Zoom, and there's a plugin called Listen To. Are you guys familiar with Listen To?
Think so.
It's all one word, but what it is you put it on your master bus, on your master fader, and like if he's there at the studio, physically recording the people with the equipment, and he puts Listen To on the master fader, and it hooks you into a Zoom, just like what we're doing, but I can hear exactly his Pro Tools session. Mm-hmm. And so I can sit there and just listen and go, let's take it from the first verse again, try this. Hey, Kyle, the acoustic guitars may be a little boomy around 200 hertz or something, or what, like, are you hearing this? And it's worked great. We're still currently working on a record right now that we're finishing up. A guy named Maurice Mangum, who lives in Tallahassee, great singer-songwriter, and we've done the whole record that way. So that's the newest thing, though, is producing remotely, which you can only do if you have an engineer that you trust.
Yeah, true, for sure.
Yeah, and Kyle's great. So Kyle, I'm gonna say his name wrong. Alagood. Yeah, at Gasoline Alley. He's great.
Any current projects you're working on besides this Maurice Mangum, did you say?
Yeah. I mean, let's see. I'm working with Keto Peters, who lives here in Santa Fe, but we're doing it all remote. I'm just mixing right now. I'm not. I did do a record last year where I produced him remotely. He would record himself on acoustic guitar and vocal to a click track or to a drum loop. And then I would kind of do everything else and then mix it, and we would just do it all talking over the phone or in a Zoom session. Let's see. Those are the... I'm trying to think if I'm forgetting anybody else that I'm mixing right now. I almost was working on some Puddle of Mud about 2 months ago, but I'm not sure. They had a bunch of things that they had recorded over the years that they were wanting to get mixed and stuff. And I'm in the running with other people, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be one of the final mixers or not on that. But let's see. That's probably it right now, I think. Other than, I should mention my own thing. I'm always trying to finish my next record of myself as an artist. Great. So
good. So I notice you're in your home studio there in Santa Fe. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Did you buy that house from Glenn Fry?
This house that I'm in right now, no.
Oh, okay.
My ex-wife and I bought that Glenn Fry house, which is 5 minutes from here, right? It's very close to here. And I built a studio there, which I still rent from the new owners. great radio journalist, Gil Gross, bought that. He and his wife bought that, and so it's still there. And we did buy that. We didn't buy it directly from Glenn. I want to say Fry. Did you say Frey or Fry? Is it Fry?
Fry.
Fry.
Yep.
Glenn. But it did. He was had owned it before the previous owner, I think. And yeah, so
I'm surprised that he hadn't put a studio in there. That was one of his favorite things. Was as soon as he'd buy a house,
you do that. Yeah. No, there wasn't one here yet. And the house that we bought was actually built on his foundation, because what happened, there was a fire around Christmas, or I think it was around, and this is probably going back to like, I don't know, 1990 or something like that. And so that house burnt down, actually.
Oh, okay.
So the house that we bought was built on his foundation, but there were some little pillar things, I forget what you would call them, that were out in the parking lot that had names of the songs spelled out in cement and things like that.
That's funny.
And I'm wondering if New Kid in Town was the one thing that was interesting. Was what was written out in that thing was New Boy in Town. So I'm wondering if Henley came in and went, no, New Kid.
Possibility. Well, any more questions for John Israel?
No, I'm good with those. He pretty much like some of the questions, like he answered them without me actually like asking them. So
That's what you get with a good producer.
Yep.
Or someone really verbose, anyway.
Well, I guess if you want to hijack it and ask me some questions, John, I'll try and answer them.
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm a huge Joe Walsh fan. He was, other than John Kay and Steppenwolf, which was at 11 years old for me. So at 13, I'm playing guitar with a band even, and getting paid for it at 13. But at that time, I was the biggest Joe Walsh fan, and still am. And also Stephen Stills' The Manassas record was, that and the sonics of those records too, which I know with a lot of the Walsh stuff was Bill Shimzik. Yep. Am I saying his name right? Yeah.
Simzik.
Say it again?
Simzik.
Simzik. I always say it wrong.
The man with no vowels in his name.
Yeah, Simzik. And oh my God, those records he did with Joe Walsh are just so fantastic.
He was a fabulous mentor. Bill had a sound that was fairly indescribable. I mean, he did a lot of different artists, but he was an ABC producer who the James Gang was one of his clients, his first client.
Oh, right, yeah.
And so that's where
he found them, right?
Yep, he found them and produced the first 4 albums until Joe left.
He even did one with Tommy Bolin, I think, which is that record. The first one is fantastic.
It's
the first, yeah.
Yeah, Joe recommended Tommy for the band because Jimmy Fox came to Joe and said, well, we hired these 2 guys from Canada, Ray Kennedy and Dom Triano, and they did the last record, not happy with them. And Joe said, there's this guy here in Colorado, Tommy Bolin. You need to hire him. And
my God.
Yeah. And Joe was real close with Tommy, and in fact, his keyboard player, Rock Grace, was in Tommy's band Zephyr in Colorado. Yeah. And but I had known Joe. We met, I think, in 1966 at Kent State University in an honors English class. And I'm sitting there, and this guy walks in with stringy, long blonde hair, and he sees me in the back row, and I was the only other guy in the room with hair touching his ears. And he made a beeline, sat down beside me. And from that day, we just became fast friends.
Oh, that's awesome.
And he was playing in a band called the Measles at that time.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
No, the James Gang, man, that stuff. I think before I owned, or around the same time, maybe a little bit before, my first James Gang album was the live album,
right,
which I think
at Carnegie Hall.
Oh my God. And Joe plays very differently on that record than he plays on any other recording I've ever heard. He's like over the top. He's out for blood, with his guitar and his singing. Like, It's just like, whoa, I've never heard, because, he's generally understated as a guitarist. He's very tasteful and subtle. So to hear him just go for it on a record is kind of scary.
They did that record after opening a European tour for The Who. And I think that's probably what set Joe on fire for that.
Probably. And probably also Jim Fox's drumming, which is,
Jimmy's very tasty.
It's a great three-piece band. Fantastic. And, I could just talk about Joe Walsh or Stephen Stills all day. And I've actually met both of them, but I've never gotten to talk really music. Joe was literally like 3 minutes, and Stephen didn't seem like he really wanted to talk about music when I met him back in the 90s or so. So, but those records. The
Manassas records were produced by Ron and Howard Albert.
And what a pair. I've only probably owned about 3 or 4 records that those guys did, but I noticed they have a sound, right? Just an audio.
Well, and Howard did the second podcast I ever did in the first season of this show. And we called in Howard because Howard was kind of the first engineer to go to more than 2 microphones on a drum kit. Howard went into the Army, and when he came back, his brother Ron was an engineer at Criteria. And Howard didn't know that a Shep's microphone was, at that time, a $1,200 microphone. So he took all of Mac Emmerman's expensive Sheps and put them on a drum kit. And that was the Fat Albert drum set. Yeah, they did on the console. But, but that was the beginning of that drum sound. But, they were the engineers on Layla and all the CSN, the Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and all the Stills and the NASA stuff. And they had
that's fantastic.
Yeah, that what they called the Fat Albert drum sound was sort of a trademark.
Interesting. I didn't know. So did he continue to use condensers on the drums like that?
Yeah,
close?
He did.
I only started doing that really after I'd done all the label records, and I'd moved here and I was starting to just do more local and regional people. So around 2005, 2006, I got out. I have a bunch of old 451s, AKGs, and 452s. And I had some of them I had those screw-on pads for.
Right.
The extra, and I decided, well, one of my mentors, Dana Cornock, I don't know if you knew Dana.
I did.
He was a big proponent of toms and snare, but especially toms, but snare if you could, using those on them, and I decided, well, and I always loved his drum sound. So, I said, well, I should try this. And I loved it, for one thing, you just get a lot more air and snap without having to use as much EQ,
Exactly.
So there, all of a sudden you've got that. And also the drums start sounding, but in their own way, they sound less hyped. They sort of sound more natural in a way, I found, and I enjoyed that. It was a nice shift from using dynamics, the old, well, we'll put 421s on the toms, and we'll put a SM 57 on the snare, and just, it was, I really liked it, but did you ever get to be part of the Walsh or Stills sessions? And if you did, what were the chains? I'm curious, like how did they record the guitars or the vocals or the drums on those
Well,
records? You already answered some of that
yeah, the Eagles stuff that we did, I was one of the 4 engineers on Hotel California, which was a huge honor and a major thank you to Bill for those credits. But it was an API console at the record plant in Los Angeles. And generally, it was the API into an 1176 on the guitars. And essentially, that was the chain. The tone was, the amp, the instrument, and the fingers.
Was there just one mic on the guitar?
Generally, there was a close mic, like a 57, sometimes a 421. On the acoustic guitar, we used some of the AKG 451s that you talked about. Did you ever have one with the capsule pad, but they also had a 90-degree elbow for the capsule?
I wish I had one of those because that would be great for drums, for
exactly.
snare.
It was great.
I never had that.
For snare and hi-hat, we would use those.
I did have the egg-shelled vocal diaphragm thing. Did you ever see one of those? I should pull it. I used it on. What it allows is that it's a slightly larger, and it's shaped not like an egg, but what would you call that? An oval. That you screw on, you take the capsule off of the 451 or 52, and you replace it with this, and you can do vocals with it, and it's a fantastic sounding vocal mic. The only problem is if you don't have a screw-on pad with it, if somebody's yelling into that, it's not going to be happy, But I used that for some of the first Creed record, and the song My Own Prison is that mic. I switched away from that after a while because it started not being able to take the loud moments,
Yeah.
But so, and if they did more than one mic on the guitar amp, I guess they probably just bust that into the 1176 or whatever, which I always like doing that too.
Yeah. Generally, sometimes he'd put either a 414 or an 87 3 or 4 feet away from the cab. And then, when it was 2 mics, it was bust to a single channel going into the 1176. And Bill was a master with that compressor. Now, a lot of the Eagles vocals were done through an LA2A with the same API front end. Now, when they recorded the portions of that album in Criteria, it was all through an MCI console with the same compressors.
And I actually love some of those old MCIs. They're a little noisy, but they're sort of even more pleasant than the APIs, I find. There's something kind of, I don't know. I've really enjoyed some of those MCIs.
They had an up and down reputation. There were some phenomenal records made on them, that's for sure.
Well, I've always been told, and it's why I don't own any MCI stuff, is that, if you wanted the tape deck or the console, are you good at maintenance? Or do you have a repair guy that lives close to you? Because, so it's okay if you live in Nashville, I guess, and who is it? Randy Blevins. There's probably a couple MCI guys there. But,
Randy's the man. Yeah.
You need somebody like that. And Dana used to crawl. We mixed my record back in '86 on an MCI at Stark Lake. And literally every other day, he had to either crawl under the console or pull cards out of it was an MCI tape deck too, 24 track. We'd be doing something and all of a sudden he'd curse and kind of bang on the console. And I go, what? He'd go, just go take a break. He'd be under the console, like pulling something out or swapping a card or something,
Yeah. I helped build that room at Stark Lake. It was built by a former MCI employee, Seth Snyder. He
Oh, this
built,
is a great studio.
yeah,
Great.
and he he made these modules that you could pack up because so many people were putting studios in recording spaces that they rented. So he had these prefab modules that he would go in. In fact, Right Track in New York, Stark Lake, and a studio in Miami, DB Sound, where I did the Judas Priest record, Defenders of the Faith, were all Seth's modular constructed studios. And
Wow.
yeah, they packed up
Cool.
the studio in North Miami, put it on a container, and shipped it to Jamaica. Rita Marley bought it, and they hauled it up the mountain and reassembled it on the place where Bob is buried. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, so it,
Wow.
but if you notice, if you're ever in Stark Lake and you go behind the walls, they're just like freestanding sets from like a movie.
Oh, cool. Now, is Stark Lake still there and doing,
It
and does
is.
it still have the MCI
No, he's got a
no,
euphonics now, I believe. He's doing a lot of Disney work,
mm-hmm.
but staying busy, still there, same
No, it's a
location.
great room. And I remember we only used that room for overdubs and mixing. So I didn't get to do drums there or anything, but I remember the live room was pretty impressive and big and nice sounding,
Yeah.
2,000 square feet.
Wow.
Well, that's about all I've got for today.
Well, thank you.
You bet. Thank you for joining us on the Real to Real podcast from the Melrose Center. I'm your host, Bruce Hensel, joined by my co-host, Isra, and would like to thank our guest, John Kurzweg. Thanks so much, John, for joining us.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Israel.
Thank you.
We have so much more in store on upcoming episodes. Make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcasting app. Join us next month for another episode with another exclusive look at life behind the board in the audio industry. And thanks to Carol Hensel for our theme music. And that's a wrap.